You all know us, but we are Patricia and Thomas Hooper of ASL Pewter. In case you don't know where it is, it's 183 South 3rd Street, just right over there. We're going to talk to you today about pewter, some of the history, and mostly we're going to be talking about casting, which is the oldest form of working with any metal.
Well, and pewter is an element that has been used for decorative and functional metalwork for over 7,000 years. And one of the reasons that it makes it's easy to work with, even in its solid form, it melts at 465 degrees. And because of that, it melts, which is a campfire temperature. So if you have a crucible of sorts, you can melt it very simply and pour it into molds. And we're going to kind of go over the history of some of the molds and things that we have in our collection, and kind of talk about that. When refining the metal, oftentimes the tin, that is the primary ingredient in pewter, is found in big ribbons and chunks in the ground. Pliny the Elder, in a 3rd century Roman text, writes about ribbons of pewter, of tin, coming out of the ground in northern Spain, up in the desert, and they were more than 100 man lengths long, 3 heights of a man tall, and the width of a man. And so, and that's just, imagine that's a huge amount of metal. And tin was a primary ingredient in bronze alloy. Typical bronze was 10% tin, 90% copper. And because copper was very prominent in making of implements, and bronze with tin added to the copper created something that was better than both of them. It is much stronger. It was able to use as weapons and even hold an edge in swords and plowshares. So it created a material that was greater than the 2 original pieces. One of the things that pewter was very popular, the tin was a silver color. And so you had bronze, which was kind of a dark, deep, rich gold. You had gold, which was a bright, shiny. Silver that's bright, shiny, but then it tarnished dark very easily. And so you had this contrast of metals. And by alloying them with different resources, you could create a variety of functional metals.
Tom mentioned that bronze was mostly copper with a little tin. Pewter was mostly tin with a little copper. We had a question earlier about lead in pewter. Lead, as long as we've known metals, has been a base metal. Everybody knows it. Everybody knew it thousands of years ago. No one was ever going to put a base metal with a semi-precious metal. It just didn't happen. Our whole concept that there's lead in pewter is an urban myth. There has never been lead in pewter of any noticeable amounts. Trace amounts maybe sometimes in the solder that was used to put pieces together. But no one was going to cheapen their tin and copper, which were both considered semi-precious, with a base metal. It would be like taking a lovely piece of turquoise and setting it in a ring with gravel. It just didn't happen. There were alloys out there that people were using that had lead or cadmium or mercury or arsenic or lots of other unpleasant stuff. It wasn't pewter. It was a base metal. It was sometimes called layware when they made pieces out of it. Were there people that tried to pass it off as pewter? Certainly. Just like people have tried for millennia to take lead and turn it into gold. Same idea.
And most of them are heavier metals by weight. But the way that we refined tin was very unique in refining metals early, before we had things like blast furnaces, electricity, or even natural gas. They would take ore that we would find in the ground, pieces of stone, gravel, sand, things like that had flecks of metal in it. And you would create an oven that was basically a chimney. And as the chimney narrows, they would actually put sticks and rods through it and dump the ores down the top of the chimney not so much that would cause the heat and exhaust from the fire to not pass through it, but to slow it down dramatically. And so the fire at the bottom would heat up, and that hot air would rise up through the chimney and then pass over the ores and the raw materials. And once the core temperature was reached, they got to see metals that flowed out. And very much the reverse of what we do now with distillation. As you raise a pot of alcohol-based material, like what we call a wash or almost like a beer, and as that reaches a temperature, different fusel oils come off of it, things that you wouldn't want to drink in your body. So the first 10 or 15% when you're distilling comes off and is thrown away as a waste product, and the rest is then, up to a certain point, is a potable material that can be drank. The same way with the metals, they heated up and they knew that the first things that came off were these mercuries, arsenics, all these foul-smelling metals that animals would touch, and they would actually get toxic and die. And they would also, like the arsenic turns green. All these metals were very bad, and they knew that at a certain point in that heating process, at 400 degrees, lead actually came out. At 450 degrees, tin came out. And then you go a little higher when you hit to about 900 degrees, antimony comes out. Then zinc just above that. And so they were able to actually, with these ores, find out where that temperature was. They didn't have a thermostat. They just had people who were very skilled at this. It was all done by feel and touch. Just like a blacksmith today, they raise a piece of iron, put it in a fire. When it hits a certain color, they know how to keep that color the right temperature to work the metal. And so these metals would come out. When we were talking about the ribbons of tin coming out of the ground in Spain, they were almost all pure tin, but they were over 300 miles from water or any vegetation. So they had wagon trains of mules that would have to carry charcoal and water and food through 300 miles of desert, stack these fires next to the ribbons of tin, heat it up, and it would melt down into and they'd have little designs they draw on the sand, and they made what they call pigs. These pigs would then be put on the mules and taken back out, so it was a constant train of raw materials going both directions.
You can follow a lot of the expansion of the Roman Empire by not just people in slavery, which is what we think of a lot, but by minerals. They went to northern Spain for the tin. They went to England for the tin. They went to Germany for copper. The reason they expanded was because they needed these elements to create what they wanted to have in their empire. So this is an ingot of pewter. This is what we would use in the shop to melt down. We can pass this around if you like. It weighs about 8 pounds. Anybody want to come up and grab it? It does have some sharp edges, so be careful.
And this is how we purchase it already alloyed. What we're using is what they call 92 alloy, which is 92% tin, 2% copper, 6% antimony, which is a standard pewter material that was standardized by the English Pewter Guilds in 1635.
So it goes back a ways too.
As what they would call fine pewter. And their guild members would use this, and because with that material, they knew that it would stay shiny. Because if it had lead or cadmium or the other heavy metals in it, it wouldn't stay shiny, like your battery terminals on your car. They get a little oxidation on them, they dull up right away. The old expression, it won't hold a shine to that, it has to do with pewter, because if you leave pewter on the shelf and just don't touch it, it should stay shiny.
It still stays shiny.
If it's a base metal or a lay metal, it will, as it lays around, it will darken. Well, the next thing is an interesting mold, and this one we pass around, but we'll leave it up here. It is actually a religious piece. It's a carving that was carved into soapstone somewhere in the mid-1500s. It is highly polished on this one side. It was designed in the way that it's shaped to actually be a mold, but we have not been able to figure out how to cast in it. It has gates and vents for the metal to get in, gates for the metal to be poured in, vents for the air to escape. But in the further research we found on this, we've actually saw some pieces in Europe where this figures were actually done in a special process where they put gold foil on this, and they would rub the gold foil into these recesses to create that decoration. And it's in a repoussé. And so, but it was at one time using casting. You can see that it's rough. It has rough wood on it, and we have no idea what its other sources are. And we purchased it with an estate, and it was supposed to be work for pewter. We have tried it. We've not been able to get it to work, but it's one of the oldest pieces that we have that has a reference to pewter wood.
It's likely to be German because it has a stein here and a pitcher and a hand and a sun. And a lot of times in Germany they did big trees or crosses that had the trades of the village.
And so it may be the pewter's trade represented on it, may be the reference, but it was in some manuscripts that were done on vellum that reference it as a pewter worker's piece. So we don't have, but I wanted to share that with you because it's very unique. And you're able to come up and touch that a little later. The other one is another unique piece, which is, this is a very old, probably early 1700s spoon, and half the spoon was missing. And somebody was very industrious. They carved the second half of the spoon mold out of soapstone. And soapstone was actually a common way of making simple molds.
So this probably would have been a baby spoon. The bronze half would have been original, and the soapstone half is somebody's very early recreation.
And the only problem is that we don't use it partly because the soapstone is very fragile compared to a bronze piece, because the other half of the mold is actually bronze. And those are just some more fun things. But Pat's going to show you a couple of molds that she likes to cast in, and she just has fun with these because this is part of the history that we do over there. And if anybody has a question at any time, please raise your hand.
Oh yeah, we're totally interruptible. And if you want to come up and take a closer look at anything, feel free to do that too. A lot of things we'll be passing around. So this is a spoon mold. It was made in about 1650, probably in England, although we don't have exact provenance on that. The spoon that it makes is this. That's a finished piece. We'll pass that around. We call it a slip top. That's because of the shape of the handle. I don't know who came up with that, but that's what it is. This mold, as opposed to being bronze, like a lot of our molds, is actually brass. That's one of the ways we know the age of the mold, by what it's made out of. Now I have cast in this one. You can see where it's here at the top. I haven't broken it open yet, so we'll see if I got a decent cast. I got a pretty good cast. There is one problem. This line right here, I don't know if you can see it, and I'll pass that around too. It's what we call a cold pour. So I'm guessing when I was pouring it, I actually broke my wrist a little bit. And so there's a cold line there. It actually can break on that line, so I would throw this one back.
Fortunately, we can recycle our mistakes down. And this mold is unique in that it's a very old mold, but it's still in almost perfect condition, and we're able to use it. And once you get the rhythm of casting it works. They're kind of like, each of these molds is their own entity. They're like an old cast iron frying pan they've had around forever, and they get seasoned just right, and they like to work at a certain temperature with a certain amount of it. And all of our molds are like that, and we have to become very hands-on with them. Our molds.
Can you all see the cold line?
Uh-huh.
We have in our collection 38 spoon molds that we are using. and they represent a variety of time periods, all the way up to the American Civil War. After the Civil War, other forms of flatware, a lot of us have seen in our collections steel forks and spoons that have wooden handles, some with some pewter inlay. And so that was in this transition to what we have now, which are pretty much stamped stainless steel spoons and forks. Silver was always the standard by which the pewterers judged their work, because they mimicked what the silversmiths were making in making it with a lesser material, less expensive, but with simpler lines and designs for the public that could, work with pewter. By purchasing a pewter spoon, it was so much better than a carved wooden spoon that would crack and get it hot, cold, get it wet, get it dry. And a pewter spoon can last a person a lifetime, and they also were recyclable. If you scrape, we have a couple of old pieces in our collection that you can see where they scrape the bottom of the bowls, and sometimes half of the spoon bowl is gone. But you can actually take them back to a pewterer and bring in scrap pewter that if you put something near the fireplace and it got too hot and it melted, because the pewter will melt at 465 degrees. You can bring it back. We actually repair a lot of candlesticks. People have taken them, put them on the stove, heated them up, they melt on the stove, the wax stays there, they bring them back, we cut them off, put a candle top on them. But that melting at 465 degrees is a blessing and a curse. Makes it really easy as a metal for us to work. But also for consumers, it's good. You can't use it for cooking. You can use it for serving pieces and for eating ware and storage, but you can't use it for heating on a fireplace or even a modern stove or oven, because it just doesn't, it's not good for the pewter when it gets melting on your stovetop.
No, that's bad.
How long does it take for your bowl to cool before you can pull the spoon out?
Well,
This one, I'll keep my gloves on, but I'll pour it. I don't even think I need to count to 10 most of the time. I can see from the sprue at the top, when it starts looking like that, it's ready to come out. Now the mold is still hot, and the spoon is still warm, but I can take it right out.
Well, we preheat the metal molds to a temperature. We have a very scientific way. We have heat-proof gloves. You hold on the mold and you count to 4, and you start to feel the heat. It's perfect. If you count to 5, it's too cold. You count to 3, it's too hot. Each mold is a little different. Some of them want to be poured a little hot, some want to be poured a little cold. And you can see it there on this spoon that there's hardly any flash or any leakage on the spoon that Pat passed around. If we get the mold a little too hot or don't hold it tight enough, it'll have some leakage that it'll seep out a little bit on the seams of it.
I'll show you that on the next one.
And every mold is different. We can have 10 spoon molds, every single one of them. We actually have a kind of a list. It's like we have 3 or 4 places where we clamp them. We have different clamps that we clamp them with different tensions on the clamps. We have a piece that is just a wooden scissor that you hold it with, and that works for a lot of them. It's actually made. We saw one in a museum in Ghent, and we mimicked that for us to use for holding the spoons, and it works for a lot of them. But some of them that we have, because they're all very old, have some warpage to them. We have some spoon molds that if you put them together, they kind of, and so we actually put those into 2 different clamps that are heavy duty to get them to clamp down. And we actually try to leave them in that and let the mold cool. We preheat those molds by putting them on the metal furnaces to get them to a nice, fairly warm temperature. That way the pewter goes all the way down. That handle is very long, but the metal has to go all the way to the bottom of the mold. And the bigger the mold, and the thinner it is, if we do a plate mold, there's a lot of space in there to pour that metal in. Our biggest charters right now are 14 inches in diameter. And we have to pour a perfect pour, the whole thing. No bubbles, no turbulence, no anything. And there are days when we can't get 1 or 2 of them to pour after working all day long. In Europe, we've seen molds for that actually are large molds that are flat, and they actually put them into the fireplace and heat them up in the fireplace, and they pour them with 2 ladles on each side, and they're up to 40 inches in diameter. And it may take as much as 30 pounds of metal, because there are gates and vents. You see the ways where it has a little pouring thing. That's a gate where the metal goes into the mold. And then we have vents, which are little lines that we sometimes, even in that mold, has a couple little lines in it for the air to escape so it doesn't burp.
Air's got to go someplace.
And some of the molds, you'll actually be able to see. If you hold them at the light, you can see right through them. And if it's uneven all the way through, oftentimes they'll cast perfectly with just a little bit of air popping out. And this is Pat's favorite mold, and this is her baby.
We're kind of being chronological. So this is our crucifix mold. This was made in France in about 1750. And we can date it by the way the mold is made. We can place it by the iconography. This is also a bronze mold, 100 years later than that one. It casts this crucifix. You can see that it has several pieces to it. So we put the pieces together, put the mold together. I actually just hold it with the heat-resistant gloves and pour, and hold, and count, and hold, and count. And it takes, maybe a minute till it's hard.
And Pat's pouring that with 550-degree metal, and the metal becomes solid at 465 degrees. The metal will still be hot when we remove it from the mold, but it will be solid.
So where the metal went in, that's the gate on the mold, makes a sprue on the piece. Where all of this stuff is, that's flash, that's where the air went. I'm okay with that because that means I don't have holes in my piece. From this point, it becomes like a woodworking project. I'm going to cut off the sprue. I'm going to use a series of sanding belts and wheels and remove all the excess material. Then we're going to dip it in acid and make it black all over. We're going to put it in a vibratory tumbler that has a polymer resin that's impregnated with quartz crystal. It'll tumble overnight. It'll remove the outer layer of black, but it'll leave the detail. And there's one being passed around that's finished, and you can see that, and you can see the detail in it. I will pull it from that tumbler the next morning, and it'll go in another vibratory tumbler that has porcelain beads and a polishing soap, and it'll come out looking like the one that Sarah's got right now. Yeah, I love this piece. I love the iconography. I love that it casts really easy. So if you're ever in the shop, you can ask me to demonstrate casting this. I will be happy to do that. Go ahead and pass that around so people can see how it casts.
It does have a little bit of sharp edges on here. But
yeah, watch out for edges.
This mold came to us in kind of a weird way. I look on online auctions, estate auctions. There's some larger auction houses on the East Coast that have catalogs. They're always advertising them, and on eBay or other auction sites. And I also search the Old World or English spelling, the M-O-U-L-D. What we would do is that black stuff you'd scrape off. They still consider that a mold for food and other things. And I found this, a gentleman in Idaho had it. He was a serviceman stationed over in France during World War II. And he brought it back and he was selling it. And he had spelled it with the European spelling, M-O-U-L-D. And he had a minimum price on it. And I bid on it at what I thought was a fair market price at the time. And nobody else bid on it. So I got it for a very reasonable price. And then, but nobody, searches obscure spellings. So that's just kind of, when you're doing research, if there's alternative spellings, use them because you can get some, and this is a real treasure because we've had collectors from overseas look at this mold and they're just shaking their heads because it's like, they would have really appreciated having that in their collection.
Well, and the guy who was listing it, he said, I don't know anything about it. I got it when I was overseas. I think it's iron, and I think it's from the 1960s. Well, he took really great pictures. First thing we're doing is going, iron is not that color. And then we looked at how the mold was made. And while I haven't been at it since 1960, I've done a lot of study, and I know ain't nobody making molds like this. And in fact, we've talked to bronze foundries, even art foundries, and said, hey, could you recreate something like this? They have no idea how. Today they don't know how those types of molds were made. And so, like I said, we can date it based on how it's made. We can place it based on the iconography. If we're correct on the date, and we are, 1750 means it's probably not Northern European, and it's probably not English, because they're all Protestant by then. So we're going to look at Spain, France, Portugal, Italy. And just the way the Christ figure is done, the way the two angels are collecting his blood in the chalice, Our Lady of Sorrows on the back, the little tiny roses of Sharon, the way that's all done tells us France.
What is the function of that extra little piece that you take out?
So it goes together this way, and
and
that's where you pour in, and this is how you can get it back out, is tapping these guys out.
And basically what it does is it creates a flat surface on the bottom once we remove the gate.
So this is actually the bottom of the crucifix, and it fits.
And if you look at the mold and you come up here, because it's a little heavy to pass around, the little lines that are on the very bottom of the finished piece it gives us a cutting
So it gives us a real flat surface and helps with some of the decoration on it as well.
Pat, on that spoon, the one that you took out of the mold, what did you say caused the imperfection?
I probably bobbled when I was casting. As I'm pouring, I broke my wrist. Basically,
it's a little tiny 8-inch hole that you're trying to pour 550-degree metal down while you're holding it in your hand. And if you do this a little bit, a little shaking, it breaks the stream of the metal going down into it.
Leaves a line.
So yeah, so Tom mentioned it melts at 465, but it's really pretty solid at 450. And so if I'm casting at 550, I don't have a lot of leeway between when it's liquid and when it's solid.
And generally the mold itself is around 350 to 400 when she's pouring. And so there's that little heat disparity. And you get to a certain point where you get a sweet spot. Because you cast too fast, when the metal is tumbling in, it's actually a little more liquid. It tends to flow through the mold quicker. It can create turbulence, which creates little air pockets. And too slow, or having an imperfection in your casting, you break your wrist a little bit, will cause a line or a hole or a bubble in the spoon.
This was liquid when I poured it in, and then I had just enough of a break that the surface of it started to cool before the next liquid went in.
Because you're pouring it through a little tiny, just a 1/4-inch hole, and it has to spread out for that almost 2 inches width of it. So you have to really be pouring it perfectly. And if you overshoot and you miss the mold, you're pouring it on your hands, so you're going, ooh, don't want to do that.
Yeah, I really don't want to do that, yeah.
And so it's a touch thing. It's just like everybody has their family recipe. If you're making noodles, everything has to be just right. You got to learn how to use the rolling pin. The thickness of everything has to be perfect. The temperatures have to be perfect. And it's very much like doing food things.
Yes.
Are new molds still being made, and do you make any of your
We'll get there.
We're going there next. We're doing all the historic molds because we do make a lot of molds, but we have not found a competent foundry that will make molds like the old school did. One of the things that was really important when people came to this country was bells. And that was the first industry usually set up, was a foundry to make bells, because you needed them for call to worship, you needed for town meetings, you needed for emergencies, and the bell sound travels. And so that was one of the first, and that was one of the only industries that the British allowed the colonists, especially in northern portions of New England, in that area, to actually have, because you needed bells. And if the bells are extremely heavy, and trying to transport one of those in a ship that's doing this all the way over here, it's going to break the ship. And so they allowed people to do that, but you could also make, if you have little metal left, they were very difficult to work with the authorities because they were taxing all the raw materials that were brought in. So if you brought in metal to make bronze bells, and you brought in 500 pounds of metal, your bells better weigh 492 pounds, or they're knowing that you're making something out of the back door. Of course, and you felt the weight of this little spoon mold is probably 7 or 8 ounces. So you had an enterprising foundryman at the foundry. They might have some of their buddies over for a couple of libations after hours, and maybe a spoon mold might fall out of the crucible.
Did pewter manufacturers use cartouches to mark their materials? Like
They did. The English pewter guilds had certain marks that they put on them, and also even we have a lot of pieces in our shop that are Victorian in era. They have a stamp mark on them because they pay taxes on them, but they also had purity marks. It had to be stamped with that because they did hardness testing on them to make sure they had no lead or other impure metals, because almost all the metals that melt at a lower temperature than tin are softer. So they had basically a crimp they put on it, and it had to go through 2 or 3 notches before it made a mark on the finished piece. And then they would stamp it with them because that would be your taxes were paid on it.
A lot of American pewterers did mark their pieces, and that came principally from the English pewter guilds.
And we didn't have a guild mark over here, so a lot of them put an X on it, which means that they felt that it met the standards of the English Pewter Guild, which is the strongest guild in the world. It was established in 1435.
Well, would they put their own mark?
They would often put their initials, and we have a lot of examples of those pieces in our shop. And at the French Center for Colonial Life, they have a big display, and a lot of our earliest pieces are over there in that display, and some of them have their marks on them.
We also have reference books that have pages and pages and pages of marks. And some pewterers used several different marks. I don't know why.
And they oftentimes, because
I like this eagle, but I also like just putting my initials. Okay, whatever.
well, as you can see, molds are here. Their molds were very expensive and very precious, and they would often loan them out. It would be, okay, you've got a teapot mold, I've got 3 spoon molds. Tell you what, you let me have your teapot mold for 30 days, and you can take my spoon molds as collateral, cast as many spoons as you want, I'll make teapots. And they did, they loaned them back and forth, and a lot of, especially the Danforth family and the Boardman family, they're actually molds that were used for generations, and one is a beaker, and it holds 16 ounces, and they had a mark they would put on the bottom of it, but they also had lines inscribed on it along the top of it. You see some little decorative lines, and each generation used a different line and different placement of the line.
So one might have it a third of the way up from the bottom and have a double line.
So
one might have a single line around the very top.
So we do a reproduction of that, and I put a single line around the top because that's the earliest that they have records of that family using that particular mold with that design with a line there.
But the one we have in our collection is from the grandson of the original Danforth.
And there's a line.
And he has the 2 lines in the middle. But he also has his mark. He and his brother, TD and SB, Thomas Danforth Boardman and Sherman Boardman.
And there's a lot of documentation of partnerships. Somebody might get an order for a certain number of pieces. There's one shop that they had 18 spoon molds, and they had a contract with a company. And this is just after the American Revolution. They had guys that were going out there, and they were contracted for a distributing company. They would basically, it was a general store on horseback, and they would take it out there in the traveling tinker's wagon, but they had to get supplied somewhere. And there's one person that had 18 spoons. They were contracted in 1 year to provide 100,000 gross of spoons.
Oh my God.
Gross.
But remember, okay, how many people were there in America at that time?
And
Somewhere around
everybody
about
needed a spoon.
almost 2 million people, and everybody needed a spoon to eat with. It was kind of hard to eat with, the fingers only can do so much. And you have a knife, and you plastic can twist to a fork, but a spoon is something hard to make out of iron. If you see blacksmiths, when they come to the festivals, they don't make spoons. They'll make spatulas and things because they're flat, but that dome thing of a spoon, especially for a spoon used at a table, is difficult. A pottery spoon lasts one meal before somebody drops it and breaks it, and a wooden spoon doesn't last very long. And we did some things with horn in America, and horn was very big in a lot of countries in forming into spoons because you could actually cut the horn, soak it in a material called water glass, and that would help boil it and soften it, and then you put it in wooden forms and clamp them down, and then trim the spoon shape out of that.
It's called water what?
Water glass.
Oh, water glass.
And I'm trying to remember I can't remember the exact formula for it. But we're going to go to our next thing, which is our latest
antique acquisition.
We actually were contacted by a woman in North Carolina, and she had this plate mold for an 8-inch plate. There's a time during the federal time period, late colonial into federal period, it was called the 8-inch plate period, and everybody made 8-inch plates. This was the plate that would be your dinner plate. Everybody had them, everybody made them. This mold was made in New England around 1780. It has the natural hinge that is on it, so you can actually clamp it and pour through this small gate. I have a plate here that I've just taken the gate off and taken the edges off that were rough. It's a nice heavy plate. It's ready to be satin finished and then polished. It has a couple of imperfections in it. I'm still learning how to use this mold. I've cast it a number of times, and it's a little finicky. And so I'm still learning. And there's a learning. I probably cast 45 or 50 pieces out of it, and it's I'm being very successful in casting them, but trying to get them to be as perfect as possible. And this is, you actually have to clamp it like that, and then it has this narrow spout up here. And if you come up here later, this has to sit in just right, and there's still a little bit of gapping, and you want that gapping for the air to escape. But it has a almost half-inch seam around the edge where they clamp together.
This, if you look in any of our research books at plate molds, this is how they work. And this is the first one we've been able to get our paws on that has the clamp and everything. What I think is really fascinating about it, this is original, this back strap.
And the front one as well.
This file.
No, actually, there was a wooden handle we put on that.
Oh, this would have had a wooden handle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There would be a ring that would slide down them to tighten it.
To hold them together.
And the ring is missing. This actually, woman in North Carolina contacted us, and she's in her 80s now. And 50 years ago, she had a little craft business, and this is one of the molds that she made. She made plates with this, and she would actually heat the pewter up in soup cans in her oven, and heat that up, and then we have to with pliers and pour one can and then the other can into the mold. And she said it took about 21 ounces, which is about what it takes to pour that mold. And she would get, maybe a dozen pieces every year to take to craft shows.
When we agreed on a price for it, the only thing she asked us was that we cast her a plate and send it to her, which we did.
And plates like this are almost irreplaceable, the molds are. And they're, extremely valuable. And we
are delighted to have it.
And there's a few of them in American museums. Most of them are in museums overseas. And
So what do you have to do to the one that was passed around to get all the little imperfections?
Well, basically, it now becomes like a woodworking project. So we use types of sandpaper in different formats. And we start at a very, most sandpaper, a lot of times people start at 120 or 80 grit. We're starting at 400 because we don't want to take off very much of that. You see those incised lines that are in it? Those are in the mold. We don't want to remove those. So we have to be very, it's a matter of trying to find the right amount of pressure and the right grit of polishing material to put on there. And remove that again, do a satin finish all over so it's nice and even. You hold it at the light, you gotta get the light and glint off of it to see there's any imperfections. And then we polish it. And there's still some imperfections here regardless. And if you look at the antique pieces, none of them are perfect either. And they cast, and everybody had 8-inch plates. And this is, and some people are really surprised at the weight of it, but that was a durable plate. That would last for your family for generations. We have a lot of plates in our collection that are bigger and different sizes. And we have no idea who made this. There's no maker's marks on the mold or anything like that. But we can tell by the type of screws they're in and the type of hinge. We talked to people in New England at the Smithsonian trying to date it, and we kind of came up with that 1780 as when it was made.
Which is right in the middle of the 8-inch plate period. We talked a little bit, I'm sorry, we talked, oh, go ahead.
Well, there was a family in North Carolina where this mold came from called the Reich family. And all of their pewter equipment and everything is at the Winston-Salem Museum. And they have a phenomenal collection there. And they have all of their equipment, including a wooden sawers with a screw clamp to hold the mold in place. And they have a sundial mold there that is just beautiful, and an inkwell mold. And they have some doses there that cast those about once every year to year and a half. But even that, they've lost a lot of people who are wanting to do that. And of course, that takes funding, and being a museum, trying to do living history at it, it's hard to interpret that and have full-time interpreters actually making things. Which is why we try to, in our shop, have people watch us make stuff every day. Trying to get people to understand that people are actually making this and have their hands on it.
I wanted to talk a little bit about our finishes. Some people think pewter is dark gray, and that's only if it's been mistreated. Or
it's very old.
Well, it still had to be mistreated. A colonial woman, if she had something that for some reason got dark, she'd take it back to the pewter smith and have it made into something else. She would never let the public see it. A satin finish, which is kind of how that plate is. It isn't polished yet. Or if it had been gone over with a really fine grit sandpaper. Satin finishes were done by the apprentices and journeymen. And the buying public knew at a glance this was not the work of the master smith. This was the apprentice or journeyman, and I shouldn't have to pay top dollar for it. And that was indeed the case. The polished finish meant that a couple of things. One, it was the work of the master smith. Two, it was the best alloy available because it would hold a shine. And so most of what we offer is the polished finish because it's the work of the master smith and it's the best alloy available.
And one of the ways that they maintain the polishing, the polished pewter, because it will water spot, it will get some hand, as things do when you're working them. Cabbage was a staple of food in early America, even in the cities. The outside leaves were always rough and tumble, and you fed them to the animals, but they would actually take the leaves and rub the pewter plates with those to help polish them. It had they had just a little bit of fiber, was just enough of an aggregate to rub it and polish it, and the juice from the cabbage was a neutral pH and would help polish and help it slide across the plate and help keep them clean.
So, what did the people use they didn't have 400 grit sandpaper?
What they basically would use stones, river rocks and stones, because they have different grits, different, you crack a stone open, you see the grain in it, and you would actually use that to rub on it. And you would actually take these stones, you see how this has the grooves in it, the plate? You would actually create a stone that had that shape. Rub it on iron or whatever, and match it to the shape of this so you could get in there and rub that. And you didn't need to rub it very much. It's just, you can see that on that plate, it's just a surface. It's just a little bit of just almost like a fog on there. And if you measured it, it's hardly anything at all. It's just a little touch with something, it'll come off. You can actually take a very fine sand and water and just rub it, but it's got to be really, really, really fine because you don't want to add scratches to it. And that's all polishing is actually scratching it with smaller and smaller particles. When we do our final polish on this, is actually it's about 3,000 grit impregnated in wax, and the wax adds the lubrication and adds a little heat, and which is where we get the polish on it when we hand polish the plates. So we're gonna switch to 1930, and everybody who's been in the shop has seen Christmas ornaments. This is a production mold for Christmas ornaments. It's made in a vulcanization process where we create masters that are flat masters like this, and put several masters in a mold.
You can see the cavities. It's all the same cap.
And then when we cast it,
That's it as cast. Oh, I'm dropping pieces.
so we get in. So that's a production mold.
This
So
process was developed, it's called centrifugal rubber mold casting. We cast in a centrifugal rubber mold casting machine. We call it spin casting. If I can pry this thing off.
So this has multiple cavities of these wonderful little kitty ornaments.
Kitty ornaments. And I think I'm not going to pass that around because it's falling apart. It's okay, I want it to fall apart.
We'll do this.
Yeah, we can pass those two around.
One as cast, one as finished.
So
And we make these molds in-house.
this is the most contemporary process we use, not the most contemporary material. We'll get to that in a minute. But most contemporary process, and it's from the 1930s, maybe a little earlier.
And if you,
So we take a raw sheet of rubber, put all of our original pieces in it, whatever we're going to make. In the case of this mold, we actually put a spider in it that created all of the gates for the metal to go in. There's a keeper in the center, so we got a nice round hole. Put alignment nuts in, because if you don't have the alignment nuts,
it shifts.
it shifts. There's a couple molds Tom forgot the alignment nuts on. I can still cast them. I cast them every time I do. Then we put another piece of rubber on the top, and then it goes between two iron patins in an iron ring, and we cook it.
It's like a springform pan.
It's like a springform pan on steroids. And we cook it at about 350 degrees for about an hour for a 1-inch mold.
And we want it, once we get the mold hot and the rubber starts to liquefy, we actually put it under pressure to 20,000 pounds per square inch for that rubber to liquefy completely and get pressed into all the little detail and nooks and crannies of the models that are in the mold.
Because the raw rubber becomes liquid at some point. It's still really viscous, but it's liquid enough to form around everything. And then it continues to cook till it's cured, like this.
And then I have to use a razor knife to cut in all the little gates and vents to make sure the air gets out and
This
the
one has
metal
great big
gets in.
vents. But we like the great big vents because it casts really well. In
And
fact,
so-
all of them cast in that form.
So how do you make, about 16?
What we'll do is we'll make one of those, and we might, like when we haven't finished our Christmas ornament run for this. We made 18 new Christmas ornaments. We'll put anywhere from 4 to 8 original models in a mold. We'll take the first 6 or 8 of each of those out, put them in their own production mold, and reserve that mold for later on if we need more, to make more models. We'll make a model mold and then a production mold.
How do you make the first one?
The first one is either has to be carved out of wax or a material, sometimes then sent off to a foundry to have it cast in brass, bronze, We have a person out here in Weingarten that makes models for us that we can send her our sketches and ideas. She creates an original. Sometimes she does them in pewter, sometimes she does them in brass, depending on what she's working in and the detail that we need in the piece. Then we put those models right directly into the mold. Some of the models that we use are actually sculpted out of fume or sculpting, which is a plasticine sculpting clay. And they're often used in the next type of molds that we're going to show you. And those models are often destroyed in the molding process. Because the plasticine clay, if we were trying to bend it and get the model out of the mold, they'll actually break and crack.
Some of our original, especially on Christmas ornaments, some of our originals are vintage ornaments that we've been able to find somewhere and recreate.
So we're going to start with the most scientific and most fun piece. I'm going to pass this around. I'll pass you part of the mold. The original, which is a 1st century BC Roman bronze pig's head that was used to decorate armor, and so this is use that as a model, and then that's a casting that we made from a silicone mold. We have some high temperature silicone that allows us to pour the pewter directly into it. It's not like the stuff you caulk your bathtub with, but it's designed for mold making. It's actually a putty, and it comes in 2 parts, and we create that. And I put the original bronze piece in the mold, and then once it cures, I cut the original out and create gates and vents so we can pour the pewter directly into that mold. And some of
Now, I mentioned that the rubber was not our most contemporary material. The silicone is, but it's still the same process as the antique molds. Pour metal in a hole. And that's the oldest way metal was worked.
And we have several different ones of those. This is, we use some candle snuffers, and this is one with a squirrel that's very popular. And that is actually the squirrel figure.
I contend our forefathers would have worked with rubber bands if they had figured them out.
And so this is another one that's a squirrel. We have another one that Mother Nature gave us, a beautiful seashell. And we made that seashell by using that same silicone putty.
And you can pass any of these around.
And then this is another one. This is a mermaid.
Well, you cut her head off.
No, cut her tail off.
Oh, okay.
That was cast in one of these. And this is actually, the original of this was actually a carved piece of hammer. So almost any rigid material we can use to make a mold out of. There are some things that won't stick to, that the silicone won't cure next to, and those are often painted surfaces. But just like downstairs, you have all the wonderful the dinosaurs that are down there that are hand painted. Those are made in molds just like this, where they're made in an injection mold machine. But they're using silicone compounds like that in those injection molding machines. They're shielded by aluminum on the outside of those to provide a body, because the silicone, it's flexible. It'll actually bend, and it's kind of rubbery. But they put a layer of that, and then have a body that comes the outside of it that is aluminum in case of injection molding. And you can basically make as many detailed things as you want with this now. It's amazing how much detail you can get. And this is just by gravity pouring these. There's no injection molding, nothing like that. It's just gravity. If you put it in an injection molding or in a vacuum, you can get even more detail. And usually vacuum casting like this is usually reserved for more of your precious metals, because you're trying to get all that detail on a very thin, tiny piece of gold because it's so valuable. And so by
I forgot to mention on the spin casting.
So the way this is cast, we have a machine that Pat loves and hates.
Loves and hates. So I put the mold in the machine. I put a pressure plate on top so that there's going to be anywhere from 20 to 60 pounds of pressure per square inch, depending on what mold I'm using and how big the pieces are in it. And then I close the lid. When I close the lid, it starts spinning at about 450 RPMs. And I pour metal through a hole in the lid, through the hole in the pressure plate, into the hole here. And as it's spinning, it shoots out into all of the little, whatever cavities I have to be filled.
They're not cavities,
They're cavity, yeah, what he said. And we're doing that almost every day. So anytime you want to come by and watch. Any other questions?
Tell us again what percentage of what is in the
92% tin, 2% copper, 6% antimony. Or antimony, depending on what part of the world you're from.
Got a question. This one, the little squirrel, has a bell molded.
Actually, that's actually a candle snuffer. Candle putter out of thing.
It's been welded together.
Well, okay, I was going to say, how do you adhere to it?
We use a little jeweler's torch
Okay.
and wire of exactly the same pewter. We buy ingots that we use like this. We buy wire of the same material. And then the whole different process that we didn't go into today is metal spinning, taking flat sheets of metal, pushing them over wooden forms while they're turning on a lathe to create vessels. Everything from shot glasses to punch bowls.
And by the way, the little cup that's attached to the squirrel for the snuffer part is done in one of the antique molds from about 1800.
The molds or the forms that you do the metal spinning on are the most intriguing things.
Yeah,
It's like the old wooden puzzles of trying to...
Right, yeah, and some,
Yeah, Chinese puzzles.
and so, yeah, some of the pieces, like you said, the typical shape of a colonial coffee pot comes up in a bell shape and then comes out. That is wood, but in the center of it is wood sections, like sections of an orange. Because you push the metal around something, you have to get the metal out of,
You have to get
wood
the
out of
form
it.
back out, yeah.
And so those are what we sometimes call puzzle forms or break apart chucks. And there's so few people making those anymore. And for ourselves, we came on this only 30 years ago, and so there's been people that have been doing it for a lot longer than we have, and now most of them have passed on. So it's trying to teach these trades alive. This week is actually National Apprentice Week. And we have an apprentice that we've had since May, and she's working out wonderfully. And anybody who has a business that needs an apprentice, check with the Department of Labor. They do some apprentice programs, and the Apprentice Connect here in Missouri. And it just is a wonderful program to help with people.
Tom, what got you started in pewter?
Well, when I met Tom, he had a business making incense, bath salts, and perfume oils. And that's what I married into in 1990. And it was mostly a wholesale business, and I haven't left yet. It was mostly a wholesale business, and our customers started asking for accessories for the fragrance products that were not coming out of China and India, which is where most of the incense was coming from. And so we did a little research and decided that clay was not a good idea. Incense is mostly sawdust, and clay and sawdust just don't mix well. We looked into other metals like brass, and just getting into it and the equipment and the temperatures needed.
1400 degrees.
And we kind of happened upon pewter and went, oh, that looks kind of interesting. We were still living in Sacramento, California. We could not open our own foundry there, so we started designing pieces and having someone else cast them. Originally, just little pieces that would hold a stick of incense upright, or a little cup that you could put a cone in. And then he died, which was damned inconsiderate. And we had already made the decision that we were moving to Missouri by then, and we moved to Salem, Missouri, and began doing our own pewter work. We were doing casting in molds smaller than the squirrel mold, and I had a melt pot that was about this big around and about this tall that I lifted a lever on, and the metal came out the bottom. And it had a lifetime guarantee. And the fourth time I called them and said I need a new one, They said, what are you doing? And I said, well, we're casting pewter. Well, it should be fine for that. How much are you casting? Oh, 10 pounds a week. It wasn't that much, but I don't remember what it was. I told them, and they said, is this a business? Mm-hmm. Well, this is meant for hobby use. I said, it doesn't say that in any of your paperwork. And she paused a minute and she said, no, it doesn't. We probably need to change that. I said, in the meantime, I need a new machine. She said, okay.
Then we went to a 10-pound pot that you dip a ladle into.
And we went to a 40-pound pot.
And then now we're at the 2 pots we use in the shop are 160 pounds each.
What does the ladle have to be?
The ladle's iron, and the liner of the pot is iron. And then basically, it's a crock pot.
On steroids.
And basically, it goes up to 25.
Instead of, 3.
It'll go up to 850 degrees. We pour our bigger molds like this one, and we have some 14-inch chargers. The molten metal in that is 700 degrees. And we preheat the mold so we get a nice clean pour. And for the rubber molds, then to give them a longer life, we cast it at 550 degrees. And a few of our metal molds, like the crucifix, cast just fine at 550 degrees.
I cast the spoon at 550 too.
Is the antimony to help hardness or
It's hardness. It basically
Tensile strength.
Basically, and also when the antimony in the sheet stock that we use for metal spinning, when you roll that sheet stock out, it elongates the crystalline structure of the metal so it can bend without breaking.
Makes it more malleable.
It makes it more valuable, but also at the same time it makes it less bendable in just a simple act of just grabbing it and bending it. So it's a kind of makes it stiffer but also more durable.
You can spin any metal. They spin
We all have-
gold, they
we all
spin
have
silver,
stainless
they
steel
spin
mixing
copper.
bowls.
Stainless steel mixing bowls. They're spun on a lathe. Of course, it's all commercially done now, but
Yeah, it's all automatic with levers and
nose
fulcrums.
cones on airplanes and missiles are spun on a lathe. It's a great big lathe, but that's how they're done. So you can do any metal, but working with the pewter, the antimony just helps with the whole process.
So the medallions you made for the museum for our charter members, how did you make those?
They should get right here.
Spin mold?
They basically use a spin casting mold. We took the original that Joe provided for us and put that into one of these molds. Archived that original piece and that first mold. Did 6 castings of that. Put them in a mold, so we can gain casting like this kitty ornament. And we archive all the custom molds in the back. Because we do things for a lot of different companies, including one that we do Christmas ornaments for. That are she has jewelry that she has there of nautical themes, and she's up on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we have new anchors and compass stars and other things for her. But she orders 150, 200, 300 of each of them a couple times a year. And we sell them to her at a discounted rate, and then she has them on our website for about 5 times what we charge for an ornament.
Yeah, more power to her. She knows her customers.
They pay for it, so.
Yep.
Yeah, and so it's whatever she wants to do. Any other questions or anything?
I know that some of the items in your shop a couple of years ago, you started painting colors
Yes.
on them. What does it take to get paint to stick to this?
Well, actually, we're using an alcohol-based ink, which is an art ink, and we don't have to add anything to it. I just have to treat it a little carefully when we're painting it, and let it dry a certain amount before we paint over it. If we're adding colors to color and layering colors, and it's been a real process of learning that. And then we seal it with a UV sealant so that it is water resistant. I would say it's waterproof, but let's say if you have a salad bowl that's got leaves around the outside of it, you get salad dressing on it, you can just dip it up and down in soap and water, rinse it, set it off to the side to dry. It's still not scrub proof. But we found, but by basically letting it dry for a number of hours. It bonds as much as it can. It's hard to rub off, but it still is alcohol soluble because the inks are alcohol soluble. So when you're layering it, you've got something that's alcohol soluble. You're laying alcohol pigments over the top of, so they tend to blend together and run together if you don't let them dry a certain amount. We've also found that by letting the inks pool and dry a certain amount to reduce their volume by up to half, it increases the rate that they attach to the pewter, and so they're not nearly quite as viscous, and they're a little thicker, and you get a little bit more pigment per brush stroke.
Were there pewter manufacturers in the Midwest here?
We had we had one, BB and Sage, in St. Louis. They were operated in 1834 and 1835.
That's it.
The next closest was Sealu and Company, which was in Cincinnati area, and they operated early, and then they switched over to lighting, and they actually eventually switched over to doing kerosene. They did a lot of candlesticks, and they switched over to kerosene lanterns that had a pewter vessel, and then the wide wick top when they switched over to kerosene with the glass chimneys. And the next closest one were the Reichs in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
What caused the demise?
Well, Industrial Revolution. Everybody wanted something stamped out and machine made, and by the 1820s or so, they were beginning to get a lot of machine made things, and granite ware. When it came around, and that was 1820s, 1830s, it was stamped steel that was then dipped in a slurry and then baked, so it had that enamel ware coating on it. And it was lighter, and you could put it over a campfire. And basically, you could take a table service for 8 in and sell it, pewter pieces, and outfit your entire trip west. You buy a wagon, oxen, and outfit the entire wagon for what you sell that table service for 8 for.
Pewter was, sometimes you'll hear it called poor man's silver, but of course a poor man could never have afforded it. But it was considerably less than silver. It was still very valuable. There was a long period in the Middle Ages throughout the Renaissance where pewter was the 4th most precious metal in the world. It went platinum, gold, silver, pewter. And so pewter was valuable. And you can tell from the little plate, pewter was heavy. It never crossed the Alleghenies, at least not very often. It just was, it was too heavy to take with them when they were coming west. And so for us as pewtersmiths, being in St. Louis or near St. Louis, which is, I know they call it the gateway to the west, but it's not. It's really the last eastern city. And there's an eastern sensibility, so people get pewter. Get to Kansas City, they don't get it. It's a different mentality because when pioneers came, that was their thought process. We can't take the pewter, it's too heavy. We'll sell it, we'll outfit our wagon, and we're going west.
If they would drop that pewter plate, let's say it hit a rock, is it gonna shatter or?
Well, no,
it'll
it
bend.
might bend, but the nice thing is you've got a hammer you can bend. In the shop, I use rubber mallets all the time to straighten them. We have people come in and bring stuff in that we didn't make or anything and say, this is bent, can you fix it? And oftentimes I can, and often it is just tap, 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 and here it is. It's just a matter of knowing where to hit it with a hammer.
People ask me with baby cups what happens when Junior throws it from the high chair. And I tell them it'll dent and then it has its own set of stories.
Mm-hmm.
I have a charger that was made by Samuel Hamlin, who was an American pewterer, working mostly in New York in the latter half of the 1700s. And the charger has cut marks all over it. Somebody used it and loved it. And I love that about it. Pewter will mar, and that's the nature of
If you
it.
cut a steak with a sharp steak knife on your plate, it'll get a scratch on it.
Yep. And people go, I don't want it to. Well, then you don't want pewter. And I'm okay with that.
Are you familiar with a contemporary pewter maker in Rockport, Massachusetts?
Who is that?
Who is it?
I
Do you know?
don't remember their
remember the
name.
name?
I just came across the shop and,
Yeah, well, there's a couple of shops that are just merchandising in that area. They're tourist shops. There's some that are artists. I know Amos Pewter is up there in that area, but they tend to be, I think they're in Maine. They do a lot of nautical themed things, seagulls, lighthouses, there's a couple of hobbyists that we know of, and we know them
In
personally.
New Hampshire.
In
I
New
asked
Hampshire and in
if
Virginia.
they made their pewter, and she said, only certain pieces.
Right. But basically, what a lot of their merchandise, other things, and they might have a small casting machine in the back, make a few molds like this, and cast Christmas ornaments or a few things that are for their community.
There was a company in Williamsburg called Shirley Pewter, and not in the historic district, just in the town of Williamsburg. And the old man made a lot of stuff, bought some other stuff from some other people. There's a Danforth Pewter. Who's the other one I'm thinking of?
Woodbury.
Salisbury, Woodbury. And so he carried some other stuff as well. Well, he retired, and his son took over the business. The son was not a pewter smith. He was a pretty good merchant, and he brought in pewter from all over the place, including England and Germany. But it wasn't being made there anymore. And so there are a lot of companies like that, and of course now they've been bought out entirely, and the company that bought them out has been bought out. There was a point, are we still the fourth largest consumer of tin?
Yeah, I think so. As far as making tableware, we're the fourth largest by volume, by pounds of pewter purchased from as raw materials.
You guys are?
Yeah.
The fourth largest in the country.
Wow.
And we're just a mom and pop. And one of the companies has got 17 employees that's next in line.
Wow. You got two, well,
And our apprentice.
the apprentice.
Yeah. Other questions?
She's awesome.
So is there a commercial or industrial use for the metal other than the?
Well, one of the things that actually, two things actually, in 2008, they outlawed the use of mercury in making float glass. And they replaced it with tin, because tin's not toxic. They figured out a way to keep tin in these big pools. Have you ever seen like picture of plate glass, and they float the glass along in these huge pools, like swimming pool size pools of hot metal. They float glass across it, and they pull it out, and they make these plate glass. And they replaced that, and we had a problem in 2008 getting pewter at all, because it took almost the entire world's supply of tin for 1 year just to replace those mercury pools.
And then they quit using lead in circuitry.
And so they're using tin to print circuits.
That
And they're also using it now in some of the 3D printing that they're doing. They're doing 3D printing of circuit boards and things now, and they're using tin or a tin alloy in a lot of them because it's non-toxic and it doesn't corrode and it doesn't oxidize as quickly as some of the other metals that they were using. In a lot of ways, it's actually the next best one to use for it is gold. There's a little price difference.
But for a commercial use of pewter, has its alloy?
No, it's always been tableware.
Yeah, pretty much tableware and some decorative things. But the raw materials, like especially the tin, the pure tin, has a lot of industrial uses.
Right. Yeah, I get that.
And one of the problems that they've had, especially with the latest pandemic things, is a lot of the third world countries in Congo, Bolivia, other countries like that, are where most of the tin is being mined now. Of course, those are, and they're being, China has actually gone into a lot of these third world countries and purchased the mines. But when they've been closed down because of lack of personnel to run the mines, they've come under the World Mining Organization of safety issues, and so we had a problem in tin supply in this last couple of years because the mines were ready to open back up. They had to meet higher mining safety standards, which is one of the good things.
And our raw materials tripled. That was fun.
And it's come back down to about 25% higher than they were, 3 years ago. which we kind
I can
of
live with
bit
that.
the bullet. It's going to be much better now. But yeah, but tin has always been used and useful for many applications. And they also do a lot of plating with it. They'll actually plate on top of some metals with it as a transitionary metal between two different plating surfaces. Just so if you've seen quadruple plate when they're doing silver, they've got quadruple plate. Oftentimes they'll take a brass piece. They'll have to copper plate it first before they can get the silver to plate onto the brass, because silver won't plate the rest of the brass. So, and of course now with all the technology that we have, you can take almost any kind of mineral or material and find hundreds of uses for it.
Anybody else?
So if you want to learn metal spinning, watch us do that. Come by the shop sometime, because it's kind of more of a visual
It's magic.
effect. So it's basically taking a flat sheet of metal and turning it into something, from a shot glass to a punch bowl. And sometimes coffee pots or other things, whatever happen to be making that day.
Teapots, we need
You
teapots.
need teapots.
Well, thank you, this is
Yeah,
really.
very good.
I'll kind of give you a little insight into what we do and kind of how we do it. And the nice thing is the putty molds. I really like working with them, because when I make one of the halves of the putty mold and press the piece into it, basically it takes me an hour to make the mold from the time I start the mold until I'm actually pulling the first piece of cast pewter out of the mold to see if I got it right.
That's great.
So it's kind of instant gratification.
And these molds take about 2.5 hours to make, and they are 2.5 hour worth of 4-letter words.
Oh, yeah,
Can
that's
you reuse those? Could you take it?
Well, it goes into the rubber when you're making them, and it comes out with the pewter pieces. And after a while,
I mean, could you take the mold and cut it?
Can you smooth it down and make it?
No.
because once the rubber is cured, it's kind of like your car tires. In fact, it's a very similar rubber to the car tires.
And once it's cured, that's it. Yeah. And molds have a life. The rubber and silicone molds especially. It's always been our process, if you will. When an ornament mold is no longer effective, we retire it.
This one was made in '92. This mold.
It's
This
still
is way at the end of its life. But part of it is it's a thinner mold, and the detail is just kind of on the surface, more like printed on there. And so because of that type of model, you're not pulling on the mold, you're not undercutting. Like these putty molds, there's a lot of undercuts, a lot of round, whereas these are very, very flat. And the flatter they are, the longer that mold will last.
if it's cut well, and you cut very well.
Because we have to cut every little line in here of gates and vents has to be put in there by hand. So it's like, basically the little razor knife. So you have to figure, because basically your input, your final thing is solid, but the way that it gets into all the cavities in the mold, it's liquid. So you have to get the liquid in, then be able to remove the solid piece.
Fluid dynamics. Woohoo! It's still magic.
The formulas you use for your mixture, your copper and,
Well, they are standardized by the FDA.
okay.
And the English Pewter Guild standardized what we're using now in 1635, and the FDA finally approved it as fine pewter in 1964.
Amazing.
Doesn't take
So a
long.
little 330 years later.
That didn't really well.
Yeah, so I think that was, or as we like to say, one good session of Congress.
I'm awfully glad you're in town.
Yes.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, and we're enjoying it here.
What brought you to St. Genevieve?
Well, basically, we were really finally decided that we wanted to stop get off the road. We were doing up to 30 arts and craft shows a year, which is wear and tear on the body and everything else. And we had a little retail store up in Louisiana, Missouri, And we were there for a while because we had a house, we lived there. We were there was part of the Provenance Project, which is a project that was developed by some bankers and some artists to try to get old buildings that were run down and in repair in the town, to have artists purchase them at a lower price, get low price loans, and then rehab those buildings and occupy them for their businesses and try to create a retail front as well as have manufacturing or making things, which is a well thought out process and worked better in Hannibal than the other towns that were involved in it. And we went from where we were in just a warehouse to there to do that, and we got a real good taste of it. We had an idea of what could work, and then we decided that the community was having some issues, just like all the other small river communities here, but they had a problem that they had all sorts of bridges, both across the Mississippi and through the rivers in that area, that were always being repaired, and one or two of the roads into town were closed all the time. So people changed their traffic patterns. And we had a stop sign in front of our shop. We went from getting 50 or 60 people a day into our shop to getting 1 or 2 a week. And we said to ourselves, this ain't working.
Well,
so we decided, at that time we decided we wanted to look at something else. And our ideal thing was to, hey, why don't we go down near Colonial Williamsburg, go into Virginia, go to one of the historic things. And we looked at historic venues all around the country. And we looked at a place in Virginia that was going to be a village that was being created on a model of live and work and shops and tourism. And 2008 happened, is what happened with the economy.
The economic downturn.
And the economic downturn. And the gentleman that was working on the project had put all of his ready cash into developing over 200 lots for homes, put all the utilities in, all the underground utilities, all the roads, the curbs, and not build a single house. So he had lots ready to build and nobody to build them for. And his commercial area where we were going to be, and it had places for tour buses, it had museums there already. It just fell apart. And we then looked for several years, looked at St. Genevieve in 2008, and looked at where the DuBourg Center is now, looked at where the Center for French Colonial Life was at that time, and just couldn't put something together. A couple years later, we looked in Herman at some things, and they didn't have a live-work situation because we decided we wanted to do that. And then finally came back here after working on the projects and found this building that would work really good for us. And we looked at it for a number of years, and the price changed to the point that it was advantageous for us, and we felt that we could walked into the building and said, okay, if we put this here, this here, this here, that will work, and it did. And so we were able to actually, when we moved each process right into its place and set the machines up, plugged them in.
And Sandra helped by getting us all kinds of help unloading things.
A lot of the football players.
Football players, to help them unload.
And it was nice because the Audubons had just opened, and we take the football players out to lunch afterwards, and that worked out real wonderful. And then we've developed more of a clientele. The last couple of years, COVID kind of kicked us in the butt a little bit, but in a good way. This year we did 1 show.
Yay!
Away from here. So we've been here and open pretty much 6 to 7 days a week. And first of the year, we're probably going to close a couple of days for us to have a little bit of rest. And we'll kind of work that out with our apprentice to see if she can do some other things. Then probably actually hire somebody to open a couple of days a week when we're in the middle of the week, so we can stay open longer. We're starting to get a little tired. We've been working 7 days a week for 32 years. So it's time to maybe not work 7 days a week.
What you do with your spare time?
What spare time?
We
Do a what?
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, so we're ready to kind of slow down a little bit and not being
We
on the
take
road
a trip to California that was the trip from hell. Did you miss that part?
No, I heard it.
But we even sold our van that we were going to shows with. So
The big white.
Yeah, the big white van we sold. Woohoo!
But you said Sacramento is where you live in California?
Yeah, that's where we.
And then you moved to Salem, Missouri?
Uh-huh.
Isn't that kind of a shock there?
I love it.
Yeah, it was nice. Well, the thing is, our manufacturing that we had at the time was so busy. We didn't even see the town per se. We were working between work and home. Well, actually, we were very successful, build the business up, and it was still growing and doing very, very well. And then we decided we wanted to add the pewter to that. And then over the course of about 6 years, we developed that business into a position that we could sell that lock, stock, and barrel and separate the pewter foundry from the rest of that business, and did that when we moved to Louisiana, Clarksville. And then we established it, and then began doing wholesale to lots of historic sites in Williamsburg and other places on the East Coast, and then we're able to settle down and move down here and do a little more retail, and still taking care of and servicing the wholesale accounts.
And I find I like small town a lot.
Yes.
I really do. For all intents and purposes, I grew up in Los Angeles, and so, yeah, moving to Missouri was a bit of a change. But I like small towns, and I love having 4 seasons. Okay, maybe not this cold this early, but I grew up at the beach, and so it was 76 degrees, 360 of the 365 days a year. And
I grew up in a small farming community, 180,000 people when I graduated from high school, but we were 10 miles outside of the bigger city. And now there's, 870,000 people there instead of 180,000. Yeah, scary.
no, don't like it.
You drive into town, it's like, when we flew into Sacramento for a family trip a month ago.
That's our first time back in 27 years. In Sacramento, anyway. I mean, we've been back to California because his family's still there, but yeah, we're going, oh, I don't
There's a
remember
reason
this.
we moved.
Get out of the way.
And they still drive crazy.
I think St. Genevieve has been on our radar almost since we first moved to Missouri. And principally, of course, for the history. We're both history nuts anyway.
Well, we brought friends of ours that we learned from, 4th generation pewters from Belgium. And we were living up in Louisiana, Missouri. We brought them down here and stayed at Mike Hankins at the Southern Hotel, and went out wine tasting out here, because this area looks like the Mosel River Valley where Ludo grew up. And so the family came out here with us, and we spent a lot of time down here.
So if you wonder why the Germans settled here, it's because it looked like home to them. Sort of like the same reason the Norwegians settled in Wisconsin and Minnesota, because it looked like home.
So I take it when you're pouring those pewters in those molds, you can't do heavy drinking the night before, huh? Or you get a lot of those lines in your spoon.
Yeah. When we have school groups in, especially the younger kids, they just get so fascinated watching me melt things back.
Because if it doesn't turn out, she'll throw it back in the melt pot. Sometimes she'll just go, ooh, pull it out halfway. Because
and then there's just the handle and the mold's gone. And they go, ooh, this is so cool, melt that back. And I was like, wait a minute. This one's good, and I don't make a living if I don't make good spoons to sell. And they go, oh.
We just like to watch it melt.
Yeah.
And they're fascinated by the melting. Well, and that's one of the reasons, like the forged fire and blacksmithing is really big, and glass blowing. It's you're playing with fire. It's a little dangerous. And people love that. They want to get their hands dirty, and then they realize, if you do blacksmithing for a living, it's going to cost you $60,000, $70,000 to get set up to do it, to make a living.
To do it right, yeah.
And then the same way with glass blowing, it's going to cost you, about the same amount of money. And getting into pewter like this, if you're just doing modern casting and some simple metal spinning, it's basically at least that, if not more, because you have to make your own molds like this. There is nobody that you can contract to make molds. You have to learn how to do it, and there's a learning curve that starts with making a whole mess and cussing yourself out, because if you don't put a separating compound in here between this, everything bonds together. And you have to literally, with a knife, cut little pieces of the rubber away until you get to your pewter pieces. And then try to cut them out and not damage them.
Ask him how he knows that.
Yeah, because, and then,
We have different four-letter words for all of our different processes. So if you're watching us, there are different four-letter words for the antique molds and different four-letter words for the rubber molds and for when you're making the molds and for metal spinning and for welding. They're all different. We have whole little vocabularies.
the thing about the pewter that's very interesting, even though we're pouring it at 700 degrees, if it splashes out of the ladle and hits Levi's or jeans, you hardly even, you feel something hit your leg, but that's just enough insulation in there that you don't feel the heat coming through it. It's not like you're pouring it on there, but you do that. But the worst thing is when it hits the floor and bounces out under your pant leg, up above your sock, and then you do the hot foot.
Hello.
Or, you saw the molds that were rubber banded. If I slip a little bit and get metal on the rubber band and it breaks, well, it flings the hot metal and, yeah. That's another thing. When we have kids in, the first thing they always ask us is, do you ever hurt yourself? And it's like, yeah, every day.
Yeah, and then look at our shoes. You never trust your pewter with clean shoes.
Oh, mine are pretty clean, I guess.
They're new.
They're new, okay.
So,
Thank
but,
you so much.
and anybody is welcome. Anytime that the open sign is open, you're welcome to come in and visit and talk. We actually appreciate the breaks when customers or our friends come into the shop because we're in there working, and sometimes it's like, I wish somebody would give me an excuse to not do this for 10 minutes.
Plus, we have 18 new ornaments that we just released last week. So if you're looking for Christmas ornaments, we have 18 new ones. We usually do 5 or 6 new ornaments a year, and then COVID hit.
We didn't.
So this year was the catch-up year for the 2 years we missed.
So we appreciate everybody coming out this evening.
Thank you all for
Thank you
coming.
very much.
Thank you.